Okay, so the lecture today is on instrumental reasoning and its ecological costs. We're going to discuss the Steinberg reading about the United States of fertilizer. And so we have here an image of a hand dispenser for the artificial fertilizer. And we're going to use this as a case study to try to understand how a certain kind of reasoning, which we're going to call instrumental reasoning, has consequences for the environment and the ecology. So first of all, I'm going to give you some background on putting this in a historical context, and then we're going to dig into the Scott's case as an example, a case study, and then I'll end by giving you some other examples of how instrumental reasoning can affect the environment. So just to explain these other images we have here, this is from the Scott's website, and so there's this model, green is good, a better lawn, and live the lawn life. So within this, we can see some elements of instrumental reasoning, some elements of individualism, both expressive individualism and utilitarian individualism. And then we can over here see the consequences. This is the eutrophication of a waterway where there's this extensive algae growth that will cause problems when it dies off and deprives other species and organisms of oxygen in that area. Okay, so let's get going. So let me start with the definition of instrumental reasoning. That's reason as an instrument or tool for achieving a narrow, specific, predefined end. So another way to think about this is it's a kind of reasoning where you're trying to maximize either efficiency or maximize output. And one metaphor we might think about for this is the horse's blinders that I give you some examples of here. So the way blinders work for a horse is the blinders keep the horse from being distracted from things to the side. And they were invented and used mostly when horses were in environments where you wanted the horse to do one thing, and that is to pull the carriage and move straight ahead, or to run the race and run straight ahead, and to not be distracted by things on the side. So the advantage is the horse is better able to accomplish the utilitarian instrumental kind of purpose that you set before it, that is run the race or pull the carriage, but the horse might miss some stuff. In the same way, thinking as a metaphor, if we're wearing blinders and we're guided by just one goal or one narrow task that we've set for ourselves because of our use of instrumental reasoning, we might miss some things that are going on. So to recap here to move on here in the initial conception of this, instrumental reasoning is good in that you get focused, discipline, results-oriented behaviors. So we often think about, I got a cartoon here of a teacher instructing kids about the importance of having goals, and you think about businesses as really wanting to be focused on the bottom line or focused on maximizing shareholder value. But there's many cases where it's good to be real goals focused. But the bad side of it, it's not necessarily systemic or ecological. So you can miss all kinds of unintended consequences. You can miss side effects. There's oftentimes not a built-in reflectiveness or critical thinking to step back from the problem and kind of imagine what's going on. I'm going to make a reference here to the problem of invasive species that we talked about before when we talked about how ecosystems work. And here's a picture of kudzu taking over a house. So kudzu and many other invasive species seemed like a good idea at the time, in that there was a specific problem in the case of kudzu, erosion of ground, that the species was brought in to address, but it had these unintended consequences. So what we're trying to do is suggest that some of our problems come about because of this instrumental reasoning that we use, and we might do better if we had a more systemic or ecological approach. Okay, so another point I want you to think about is that instrumental reasoning is not either something that's just at the level of the individual or something that it's at the societal level. It's both. So let me break it down here for you and show you the relationship between the two. At the individual level, you can imagine many ways in which each of us every day have an instrumental orientation to things. So I work in order to pay the bills. If I'm hungry, I'm going to seek food. If I need to get to work, I might need to navigate traffic. If I'm hot or cold, I might adjust the thermostat. So there's many cases where we're involved in that kind of instrumental thinking. And there's many cases where we recommend it. So in industrial organizational psychology, goal setting is oftentimes a theory that's put forward as a way to motivate employees. If you give people difficult, specific goals and you get them committed to those goals and you give them feedback on whether or not they're hitting them, then you can get pretty motivated people. So it's very useful. And we can see the instrumental reasoning also embodied in different kinds of institutions. So by embodied, I mean it's woven into the fabric of some of these institutions that make up the background of who we are. And so even if we as individuals don't want to think instrumentally or want to think more than instrumentally, think systemically or ecologically, we're still going to be tied into these systems that pull us into that instrumental direction. So for example, in our society, the way the system is set up, it's much easier to have a car to get around. And so owning a car makes us think about needing fossil fuels to drive that car. And it puts us in a certain kind of relationship to the earth where we need to extract certain things to get certain things out of it. In the same way, we can think very clearly about how we want to provide for ourselves after we retire. And so we have retirement plans. Now, there's nothing wrong with retirement plans, and that's great, but many of us end up investing in things that we might not otherwise support. So we might invest in oil companies that dispute the climate change that's occurring, or might invest in companies that own stock in companies that make guns or companies that make cigarettes or whatever social ill you're concerned about. But oftentimes when we're investing, we're concerned about one thing: how much return am I going to get in my investment? And that puts us in a different mindset. So the retirement plans pull us into that certain kind of way of thinking. It's an institution that does that. Capitalism is a large institution in our society that gears us to think instrumentally. So we invest for profit. There's the idea that we own property, that we use that property to secure more resources, and that there's not many limits on the use of that property. We can do with it as we please. Our goal is to beat the competition, and there's this underlying kind of logic that more is better, that represents growth and potential, and capitalism pulls us into this instrumental way of thinking. And then in our case study we're looking at with Scott's, based on your reading, corporations are a specific element within capitalism that drive us in that direction. And your author goes through how there's this social legal construction that tries to maximize profit. That's a fancy way of saying that the system's kind of rigged to make sure that the executives focus on profit, and it may discourage them from looking at other things, such as the ecological impact of getting people to utilize fertilizer, artificial fertilizer, in large quantities. And then your author also goes into the legal system. So the legal system is a way of setting up certain means of control and authority, and it's created oftentimes by the powerful to maintain power. So many ways of looking at a legal system is a way of looking at, well, how did the rich get the system to give rich people what it needs? So oftentimes people will point to, for example, laws that regulate leases. They're oftentimes set up to favor the owners of the property, the leasers, to the detriment of those people that are renters. The renters have very little recourse oftentimes. So your author is going to go through how that legal system encourages and it requires instrumental reason as well. Okay, and then another point before we get into the case study is we want to connect what we've talked about with the modern transformations of society to the idea of instrumental reasoning. So this is not to say that back in the day before the Enlightenment and the Reformation and all that people didn't think instrumentally, but there's something in particular about modernity that kicks this stuff into high gear. So one thing to start with is we have the scientific and industrial revolutions. So being able to think about the world in terms of its chemical composition is, in some sense, pure knowledge, but it quickly transforms itself into an ability to have a certain kind of control over nature, and we can represent nature in a way that gives us more control. So it's this knowledge is power arrangement. So there's certain modern assumptions that are built in here, where nature is inert, that you want to control it for profit and progress, and that nature is this mechanical kind of system as opposed to some kind of enchanted reality that reflects God's will or nature's inherent value or something like that. It kind of makes us look at nature and say, hey, what's the cash value here? So there's this new form of reason that enters the world, or that at least is amplified in the world, and that's where we're trying to control the world with our reason as opposed to just contemplate it and understand God's order in it. Or to take the example of Plato's cave, when Plato comes out of the cave, or when Plato has the person come out of the cave, the way to understand reality is to look at the sun and to orient our vision towards the sun representing truth. But now there's this other way of approaching it where the individual becomes the center of reality, and the individual's ability to gain agency and control over his or her environment is what's revered, and we have a better foundation then for this utilitarian individualism. So shorthand, a lot of this stuff that we're talking about really gets ramped up in our modern worldview. And then to take this point home, the instrumental reasoning is oftentimes antagonistic. That means it's anti or opposed to an ecological view. So what you're trying to do is seek gain or progress, and you're not necessarily saying, how can I better fit into these natural systems that are maintaining the earth in a healthy way, or how can I get into better attunement with nature? So I have here a picture of kind of an extreme case of a traffic jam, and you'll see this with instrumental reasoning where, hey, it makes sense that I have a car and I have a road and I can drive places, but the aggregate impact of that may lead to problems that are not good. So traffic jams for commuters, or carbon causing climate change, or in the case of people putting artificial fertilizer on their lawn, we're getting dead zones of life in waterways, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. So this antagonism towards the ecological view is one where you have a more mechanistic kind of approach to things as opposed to a holistic. It's linear, ends focused, opposed to systemic. So some examples: fossil fuels, cars, and sprawl, the way we design cities and how we get around in cities, has a lot to do with us thinking about what's the most efficient thing for me personally, and not really thinking about the aggregate effects of each of us trying to drive cars and get around quickly. Okay, so a learning check here. This is especially important if you're listening to the video. I want you to stop and write answers to the following questions, and before you move on, make sure that you can explain these things. So we know from learning research that your ability to explain something, really working on that, really helps you understand the concept better, and it's a good check to make sure that it's making sense. So you might want to stop the video here, answer these questions, and then review what you need to before moving on. Okay, assuming you did okay on those review questions, let's move on to the case study of Scott's and how the Scott's Corporation is reflecting this instrumental reasoning. So the puzzle pieces that we're going to work through here, and this is just an outline to understand our reading. We're going to look at how the website gets us to maximize fertilizer use. So background facts on artificial fertilizer, then this scientific process of eutrophication, which is not good, then look at the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, and then some of the things, the corporate form and the legal structures that make corporations engage in this instrumental reasoning, and then kind of the moral consequences of that and some conclusions. So here we have just an ad for somebody that can come and take care of your lawn. Just to point out a few things: it looks easy, it looks very clean, he's very well dressed, it's a beautiful lawn. So that's this kind of sense that, hey, you can have control of this and not have dead spots, and to have a lawn that other people are going to find attractive. And even just the colors, it's the green and the yellow, it suggests a certain kind of attunement with nature. even though that's really not what's going on. Okay, so the website. We talked before about framing. It has all kinds of great framing going on. So one of the key visual items you encounter on the first page is this graphic with lawn basics, green is good, and then a better lawn, and live the lawn life. So you can see here the lawn basics, that's trying to get you an instrumental kind of basic, here are the facts so you can control this kind of thing. The green is good is playing into this idea that it's somehow green as in good for the planet to have a green lawn, which is a bit of a stretch. And then a better lawn and living the lawn life are some suggestions that draw on that moral source of expressive individualism, where you're trying to raise yourself up, express what's most important, and achieve a certain kind of fulfillment where you don't get left behind. And you can see some other elements here of the instrumental reasoning. You can even get a phone app. There's this process that walks you through making this clinical judgment of what your current lawn condition is, which is basically how green it is, not really how ecologically sustainable it is. And then you have some of the products, the turf builder. So that sounds very instrumental, doesn't it? This kind of, hey, this is going to build this up. It's like you're doing construction and taking control. Or this green max. So utilitarian, and it has this kind of efficiency, effectiveness kind of fetish that's developed. And also lawn food. So some suggestion that, hey, this is really an organism or a thing you're taking care of and you're feeding it. It puts you in this kind of unquestioning relationship with your lawn, and it's making the artificial fertilizer sound more organic and natural than it really is. Excuse me. Okay, and then I plugged in some things, and I was able to get, your author always got 4. Remember, that was a few years ago, so I was able to get the website to suggest 5 different feedings for my lawn. Early spring, late spring, summer, early fall, and late fall. So that's a lot of fertilizer. So what's going on the Scott's website? There's these technologies of control, both in terms of knowledge as control and certain products you can buy that give you control. And then there's various metaphors get thrown out here, these feeding levels. There's some teaching that the website tries to do, green and progress. So it's hitting on multiple moral sources, but clearly there's a strong instrumental reasoning component to it, or instrumental individualism. It's suggesting that you plug in a zip code and it can tailor make the thing to your exact needs. Here's some moral sources that's going on. Certainly, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned, there's this idea of status. How's your lawn going to compare to your neighbors? You can get some success from that. And all of this, your author points out, are different from the generally 2 feedings, so to speak, 2 applications that you might want to make of fertilizer per year according to the state ag agencies. So what are some of the basic fertilizer facts? So in 1909, there's Fritz Haber, this German guy, came up with this process of fixing nitrogen. So nitrogen is in the atmosphere, but plants can't make use of that. And there's this high temperature, high energy process whereby he can fix that and create this product that can then be used to make fertilizer. Interestingly, that same kind of use of fertilizer, this process, the outcomes of that were used to make bombs and munitions in World War II. And one of the things that caused the use of fertilizer to increase is after World War II, they had all this extra nitrogen that would have been used in bombs, and they had to find some use for it. So they said, hey, let's put it on these plants. It'll make them green. And another point is that corn is a huge user and requires huge amounts of artificial fertilizer. So your author's not getting into this, but certainly agriculture bears most of the burden for the problems of eutrophication that we'll talk about, and that lawn care is just a small part of the problem. So some other facts. Your author talks about the demise of clover. So clover is this naturally occurring green stuff that Irish people like especially. And that clover sets up the system whereby the grass can get nitrogen from the clover. And then your author talks about how, but over time, what happened was there became this new standard of a uniformly green lawn, which fits more in that modern, perfect kind of prefab view of the world, as opposed to the diversity of species you'd find in the prairie grass or something like that. And eventually that clover became a weed that people got rid of instead of using it for its nitrogen benefits. So they introduced Turf Builder, which integrated this artificial fertilizer, and they also started doing some genetic modifications of the grass to get it to respond to the fertilizer in a certain kind of way. And you've probably heard of the controversy around genetically modified organisms, or GMO, in that once you start messing with some of these basic properties of nature, there's chances that you can get things evolving to a Frankenstein kind of state that gives you consequences that you hadn't intended. Okay, so what's this process of eutrophication? Well, first thing we need to know is that we have all these waterways whereby water that goes on our lawns, that runs off our lawns into stream systems, into to culverts and sewage lines. All that stuff gets eventually filtered, or a good chunk of it, into the river system, and it takes it down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's where we have this problem of eutrophication, where that dead zone is. So how the dead zone works, you don't need to understand all the little details here, but in short, you get this algae bloom that forms that's caused by the nitrogen and phosphorus from the fertilizer and some and sewage, and this bunch of green stuff grows on top of the water, and eventually what that does is when it dies, it deprives the oxygen of seawater, and deprives the salt water of oxygen, and you get this dead zone where there's no species that can live, or very few species. And huge areas are affected by this. So this is the 2014, it's 5,000 some miles. And you have going from normal oxygen levels to the deep red is where it's the lowest oxygen levels, where we have, people that fish for shrimp for a living noticed that this was happening. And so obviously there's huge ecological problems, but it's also affects the livelihood of many people that are fishers. So think of Forrest Gump and his friends, right? Trying to make a living off fishing shrimp. If the shrimp is gone, it's kind of hard to make your living. Okay, so what's Scott's doing, and how's the corporate form relate to this? Well, your author's making the case that the corporation exists for one purpose, and that's to make a profit for shareholders. So the motivation for the fertilizer use, even though it claims it's trying to get you a healthy lawn and all this kind of stuff, it's really driven by a vision for a certain amount of profit, where a certain amount of use generates a certain amount of sales and a certain amount of profit. And the board of directors and their directions to the executives doesn't really encounter, or doesn't really consider, the side effects. If they cause every single species in the Gulf of Mexico to die, that really doesn't show up on their balance sheet. It doesn't show up as something that's good or bad for them, because they're looking at some smaller part of the system. So they're in this race, so to speak, where they're focused on their horse coming in first relative to other corporations. They want to be the most profitable for a variety of reasons, but they're very single-minded and have blinders on in terms of their pursuit. So executives are evaluated solely on the extent to which they can generate this profit, and corporations often have, your author doesn't go into this, but they're set up to limit the liabilities of the owners, which means that even if the corporation does some nasty, terrible things and goes bankrupt, you can't actually extract payment except under very rare circumstances from the people that own the corporation. And even when corporations do illegal things because of a variety of dysfunctions in our legal system, it's really hard to hold individuals accountable and prosecute individuals. So they have this very linear kind of control. They have an annual report where you're looking at how profitable it is. And in short, you have instrumental reasoning dominating the whole structure. And a key point here is it's not that the executives are greedy or that the board of directors are greedy, but there's a structure that's enforced that calls forth that kind of behavior and makes it difficult to do anything other than that. So that structure, of course, comes from our legal system where our executives are required to maximize shareholder value. And if a shareholder can demonstrate that they have not done that, that they've let another concern like ecological concern or criteria get in the way, then the shareholders can sue either the board of directors or the executives, and they can punish those folks. So there's a legal structure that puts these blinders on that makes corporations behave in a certain kind of way. And so your author is concluding that corporations live in what we might call a cramped moral landscape. In other words, if you think about a landscape as having a variety of perspectives and a variety of needs, they're attending to just one part of that landscape. And so when corporations claim that they can be good corporate citizens, your author is suggesting that that might be difficult for them to do, given the legal structure under which they operate. So there's this tension. Are corporations people or are they not? If they're people, we have this legal fiction that they are people, then they need certain kinds of rights. But your author is saying they can't be like regular people because they're so narrowly constructed in terms of their purpose, and their purpose is to maximize profit. Well, since your author wrote, we have the Supreme Court versus Citizens United in 2010. It was a 5-4 vote with the Fab Five here, the conservative wing of the court, being the ones that decided that corporations are people, reinforcing that interpretation, that reasoning that they, as people, need free speech, and therefore and then assuming that since campaign donations are free speech, with that logic, they reached the decision that you can't restrict corporate giving, and they struck down a number of laws that legislatures, both at the national level and state level, struck down laws that have been on the books for years about saying, hey, corporations can't do X, Y, and Z. And that's because historically people know that corporations have been driven to do certain kinds of things that aren't in the interest of the common good, their interest in the special interest of that corporation. So these laws have been created, but since the Citizens United, we have a whole different world. And this is just one example of that. So that happened in 2010. 2012, we saw a record level of outside spending besides the political parties. And that was a presidential year. And 2016 is likely to even exceed this level. So you can see in the last presidential election, 2008, you had a lot of spending, but nothing compared to what we had. So in other words, more and more money is dictating the outcomes of our elections. Okay, so some conclusions here. One, instrumental reasoning is it's reflected in certain attitudes, and certain values, and certain corporate forms, and certain legal structures. So it's more than just something inside an individual's head. There's a ideology and an attitude and a structure that sets up the idea of what's the bottom line for fertilizer use. That dictates what questions get asked and what information gets provided. And it leaves you in a position where certain questions don't get asked and certain benefits and losses don't register. And it makes you think that there might be some alternatives. Okay, so at this point, make sure that you can explain how the corporate form embodies instrumental reasoning and why it's ecologically dangerous. If you can't answer that question, you need to do a little review because that's the crucial thing here. So next we're going to go on to some other examples of instrumental reasoning.